Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Bonnie Claremont. I'm a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation. I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute as the Victim Advocacy Program Specialist. Been with the Institute for a little over 20 years. Prior to coming to TLPI, I was an advocate for many, many years as a domestic violence advocate, also a rape crisis advocate, and advocate for other victims of violence, particularly that which was happening in tribal communities. So I just wanted to share that background with you all, the context for today's presentation. Next slide. This is our normal disclaimer. I won't read it to you. It's just something that we have to include in all of our materials and projects. Next slide. So I have a lot of information to share with you as today's webinar. It's titled Walking in the Shoes of Victims. And what I want you to gain from this is really an appreciation for, the importance of the kind of responses, the kind of services that victims may need, and the benefits of collaboration, for example, and the importance of victims having access to advocacy programs and other services that can be helpful to them at a difficult time. So these are your learning objectives. I'm not going to read them to you, but overall, it's really just to increase your knowledge of responses that victims may need, and also the types of services they need and the benefits of working together in tribal communities. Next slide. So I want to do a quick knowledge check just to see kind of where people are at, where your thinking is. This is about Maya. She is a dental assistant at the local IHS clinic. A dentist at the clinic makes unsolicited sexual advances towards her. Maya firmly declines and tries to leave, but the dentist blocks the door and says, "It would be too bad if a misunderstanding gets in the way of your position here." Maya tells you that she now is experiencing high levels of anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and a fear of encountering Julian in common areas. What steps do you take to support her? So if you could place some of your thoughts about Maya, what are your ideas about steps that she can take in response to what's going on with her in the workplace? And I'll give you a minute to do that.
AJ Hunt says safety planning.
Excellent. Other ideas? How can you support Maya in what she's going through? What are the options? What are the types of responses and services that Maya may need?
So Charlene is saying that if you have an attorney that the program contracts with, she could be referred to discuss her legal options and she can make a choice.
Very good.
Delphine talks about assisting her with talking to HR. And that's what Deborah said as well, perhaps a conversation with the HR department.
Yes.
Chelsea says, inform her this is workplace harassment and unlawful. Discuss going to HR and consulting an attorney. Safety planning again. mental health treatment, anxiety, connect her with legal services, and give her a phone with a video and recording in HR department. Mary says the first thing I would say to her is that I'm glad she shared the information and that in no way was this her fault. And Danielle says advocate from the beginning and continue through all the steps.
Very good. Thank you so much for these responses. Definitely, it's a sexual harassment. It's behavior that's creating a hostile work environment. And I would also encourage her to, and I love the idea of safety planning, discussing safety issues. Anything that we're going to suggest to her really needs to be in the context of, is this safe to do? Even if we say, well, first maybe see what the situation is and maybe talk to Julian and let him know you don't like what he's doing. That may not be a safe option. Maybe it is. Every context is a little different. So that's also an option, but I would encourage her to document everything that happens from here on out, because if she's going to file a complaint with HR or even go outside with any kind of a civil suit, she's going to need that documentation, right? So encouraging her to document and having an advocate to provide the support, and also just being there to provide some, legal services that might be available to her as well would be important. She certainly can quit her job, but it's also important to remind her that when we quit a job, we may not be eligible for unemployment unless we can prove that she's taken all the steps necessary uh, to address the harassment, that it's clearly harassment, and that she had to quit because there was no resolution to what was happening to her. So these are some options. Bottom line, there is clearly sexual harassment. So there's also the option of looking, seeking legal services, legal advice. I also tell victims you have the option just to do nothing. Is that a viable option? And again, our approach as advocates is to support victims. They know best what's safe for them, where they are in the situation. So maybe she's wanting to ride it out for now. That's also an option. It's probably not a real viable one for most people, but we also need to, be mindful of where victims are at and what they're willing to do, what's safe enough to do for them. Okay. I'd also encourage her, if she does decide to stay and not do anything, not address it, to continue seeking outside employment, other employment, so that there's always that, those other resources or other options that might be available to her. Very good. Thank you so much. Next slide. This is a tool that I've been using for many years. It's called a continuum of violence. And this one is a little more focused on domestic violence and sexual assault. So on the left side of this continuum, we have the causes, the contributing factors to violence that's occurring in our communities, which, we can look at all sorts of causes, right? Maybe we have tribal laws that aren't strong enough. We have, you know, responses that could also be strengthened in terms of evidence gathering, or more victims coming forward to report crimes and so forth. But I think underlying all of that is some of the historic trauma, the historic oppression that we've had in our tribes, that's contributing to this, where people think it is really okay. It's okay for me to hurt someone. It's okay for me to use power and control to manipulate situations to my benefit, right? So there's a lot of, like, even racism can be causative factor in why violence happens. Other isms like sexism, where people feel like it's okay to uh, put down another gender, right? To belittle other people, And ultimately, in a lot of these situations, they can result in hate crimes where someone is being assaulted and ultimately can even result in death and homicide. So from this, the causes, we can move into like non-contact type of offenses where we just discussed the situation of sexual harassment. You know, he may not have touched her, but he made comments, he made threatening remarks about her job, right? Creating a hostile work environment for her. There's other non-contact offenses, particularly in the workplace, for example, where gestures, inappropriate gestures can be used, or name calling, or even gossip and so forth that sometimes happen in the workplace that can be intimidating or threatening to other coworkers. And there's other forms as well of non-contact offenses, sexting, obscene phone calls. We used to get some of those occasionally. People looking in other people's windows, people exposing themselves to others. These are all non-contact. They're not criminal offenses, but they could be civil, right? You could be charged with a civil crime for some of these. From there, we move into contact offenses, right? Such as actual physical contact with someone's genitals, their private parts, fondling other people, making someone touch, uh, the offender's private parts. So, and then from there, we move into penetration, either with a penetration with a penis, with an object, with the finger, of the other person's private parts. And then from there we move, then becomes criminal. Some of the contact offenses are criminal, and then the penetration can also move into criminal. Um, we we also from there we if these are becoming so violent, these any of these from causes even can result in someone being murdered, right? Where that person is going to use their ability to exert power and control. That same person may have a weapon, that same person may have a mental health problem. And all of these, we see those all the time in the news, for example, where we have serial killers or shooters in schools and other public places. So some of these attitudes, and then they can progress into other types of violence and can result in homicide. So part of grassroots advocacy, which is really kind of the focus of a lot of work that I've done and also on these webinars, an arm of advocacy is doing social change and systems change work to change those attitudes that exist down at the left end so that people understand that, if we can, revert back and look back at our tribal traditions, our tribal customs, and exercise those, with each other about respect, about equity, and we can eliminate the possibility of having this violence happening in our community. Okay, next slide. From here, I want to move into systems response, and I want to talk a little bit more specifically about domestic violence. Next slide. So when we have a domestic violence incident and case, we're looking at, other agencies that may be involved. Generally, in any community, probably one of the first agencies that might be called would be law enforcement, right? Placing that 911 call, a victim placing that call. It's either that or oftentimes advocacy. Someone may call it advocacy program and say, this is what's going on, what can I do, who do I call, where do I go? Oftentimes victims may not be thinking clearly enough or even may not acknowledging what's happening to them as domestic violence. So may not really fully understand that they have the option to call law enforcement, right? So it could be the advocacy program or the shelter that they might be calling. Um, so those are probably the two more common places. I would say maybe hospitals might be another one if the victim has sustained injuries, might be going to the ER with those because of those injuries, right? Um, And then we also, with the victim, we also have the children who may have witnessed the violence, because any of these agencies can also be helpful to children who've witnessed that in one way or another, to provide them support and safety, right? So off to the side in the corner there, you see non-tribal legal services and resources. And then after that, I put MOUs. These are all sort of the first responders, right, in a tribal community, except for maybe prosecution or courts or child advocacy. They may not be like first on the scene, or the first to be contacted when domestic violence occurs. But somewhere along that journey, along that victim's path, these are some of the agencies that may be contacted or may become involved. If the situation, uh, goes to the courts, then we have other agencies that may become involved, like batterer treatment and so forth. But off to the side, we have that non-tribal legal services. And this is what this project is particularly devoted to, is where a lot of victims may need legal representation for a number of issues. And I'll be talking more about that later on in this webinar. And this is where we want to be able to strengthen that presence, that availability of those legal services to victims, and to see a lot more collaborative work happening between advocacy programs, for example, and those legal service entities. So these are some of the agencies that may be involved. Later on in this webinar, I'm going to talk about coordinated community responses. Like, how can these agencies get together and strengthen what they do and communicate better with one another, so that there's a more seamless response for victims, and that that information can be shared, resources can be shared across over all of these different agencies. Next slide. So in the prior slide, we can move back to that if you want. What other agencies, service providers are or may be involved in domestic violence cases? If you don't remember, we could go back to that previous slide. What other agencies that aren't listed that might be involved in domestic violence cases or situations? You can put that in your chat. Schools, excellent. Yes. Kids might show up at schools and say, talk to someone at school counselor or a teacher, and say, I'm scared to go home, or I'm really, upset about mom, crying and feeling bad because dad was mad at her. Daycare centers, yes, same situation. Supervised visitation, exchange, battery intervention programming. Absolutely. Absolutely. They are oftentimes involved when there's court orders for those agencies to be the sites where visitation exchanges can happen. And also, batterer intervention programs are often involved, and they should be. This is where batterers are able to be monitored, also receive some education about why, domestic violence happens. It's not because, the victim is, acting a certain way or dressed a certain way, or, so it removes the responsibility from what the victim is doing, to really placing the responsibility on the batterer and why he chooses to batter the victim. Anyone else? Other agencies? Local
Yeah.
DHS offices, mental health agencies? Absolutely. As you'll see later in this webinar, we're also looking at places of employment, right? Behavioral health, yeah. Housing authorities, absolutely. I was just getting to that, where, we have a batterer who may cause some damages to the house, or there might be complaints about a lot of disturbances where the cops are called every other weekend because of what's going on with the domestic violence. Absolutely. Child protection. could be involved. A case could be opened, a child protection case could be opened. In a lot of these situations, I think maybe not so much physical assault or physical abuse, but more neglect. I've seen as an advocate working with families where there's domestic violence. Very good. Yes, you've provided some excellent additional agencies and services that could also be responding to domestic violence cases. And when we look at a team approach to this, any of these agencies could participate in a team approach to responding to domestic violence cases. It's really up to the team itself who they're going to invite to the table. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about systems response to sexual assault. Here we're starting to move into more criminal cases, more criminal types of activity and behavior. Next slide. So these are the agencies that generally respond to cases where there's sexual assault, right? Um, we have law enforcement, we have tribal police, and also a criminal investigator can also be involved after that initial response is made and initial evidence is gathered at the scene. The investigator can then take over looking at that evidence, interviewing people, interviewing the victim, getting more information from individuals involved in the situation, if they either as witness, as the victim, as the alleged perpetrator in the situation. We also have victim advocacy. Um, we have the community-based advocates, as we talked about at another webinar. We have different types of advocates, right? We have community-based. Often those are advocates that are either employed by a nonprofit or a tribal government entity through maybe some federal funding. Like some of you are OVW funded advocacy program. But we also had advocates that are based in prosecutors' offices. We have advocates who are based in FBI offices. We also have advocates that might even be based in hospitals or law enforcement agencies. So there's a lot of different types of advocates that may be involved in a sexual assault case. In my situation, I was a grassroots advocate, a community-based advocate. And our roles are different, and the type of confidentiality that we are bound by is different. As a community-based advocate, I had privilege status based on the training that I received. So anything shared with me by a victim is kept in absolute confidence. I won't share any of that information with anyone. Versus those that are more systems-based, they have to share information with their counterparts. If they're based in a prosecutor's office, for example, whatever the victim shares with them would be shared with the prosecutors as they build their case for prosecution, right? And same with law enforcement. If we have an advocate who's based there, the law enforcement agency that they have their criminal investigator, for example, that advocate may work closely with that criminal investigator to gather information in order to build a case for prosecution, right? We also have medical personnel, we have IHS clinics, we have contract health, and so forth. So those are places where victims may be able to go to get medical services. They may be able to get emergency contraception, but also they may want to have evidence gathered, right, for them, the forensic evidence. So this is another agency that may be involved in a sexual assault if a victim chooses to do that, to move forward with that step. And then we also have the tribal courts and their involvement in criminal cases if they are prepared to prosecute criminal cases of sexual assault. Not all tribes are situated to do that. So we also have underneath another layer of federal offices, the FBI, sheriffs, local law enforcement, and so forth that also may be involved because in tribal communities we're so multi-jurisdictional. So we have those offices as well that may be involved with their investigative individuals. We also have the Federal Victim Advocates Office. I already talked about the system-based advocates. And then we have private hospitals, those that are located off reservations and local, maybe urban areas that our Native people also utilize. And then we have the U.S. federal court system, their districts with the assistant U.S. attorney's offices. So these are all possible agencies that may be involved. And later on in this webinar, I'll talk just briefly about sexual assault response teams. And I am a proponent and an advocate for the development of teams of any type because as Indian people, we work better when we work together, when we cooperate, when we work collaboratively, we communicate with each other because we each of us brings strength to the table, to the circle, right? And I believe the same about a team response in any of these with these crimes. Okay, next slide. So victims of sexual assault or domestic violence may enter the civil or criminal system through different doorways, right? In a lot of our ceremonies, we talk about doorways. The same exists for, how we're set up in a community where, a victim may enter the doorway of a hospital or a law enforcement agency or an advocacy program or other agencies that you've mentioned earlier. So I want to talk a little bit about the response that victims may need after an assault happens. Okay, next slide. So a lot of the reason why victims may not report or may just not want to disclose what's happened to them is for the stigma, because of the stigma that's sometimes goes hand in hand with some of these crimes. Feelings of guilt and shame or feeling responsible for the abuse. Perhaps they were intoxicated, right? Or they were partying with someone and they went home with someone they didn't know well. An assault happened. Uh, Being perceived or treated differently by others, right? Especially with adolescents, they don't want to be different than others, their peers, right? They want to be able to fit in. They want to be able to be accepted. But they don't, victims don't want to be seen as different. And oftentimes I've had victims tell me that I feel like I'm wearing a sign on my forehead saying I'm a rape victim, right? And they may not even be treated that way, but they feel that way inside that they're being treated differently because of what happened to them. And oftentimes that is the case. They are treated different. And that's something that we have some control over, right? Um, Having their experiences dismissed, denied, or mitigated, right? Rather than being validated, rather than someone saying, I'm really sorry this happened to you. You didn't deserve this. It wasn't your fault. Versus the opposite of that, well, what were you doing out there or at that time of the night? Or why were you drinking to begin with? You know better. Or, kind of putting more of the focus on that versus the assault and the crime itself. Loss of status and their isolation. Absolutely, they often victims feel very minimized and belittled because of what's happened to them, and that goes along with being treated differently because of what happened. Their status being impacted and not feeling worthy anymore, and kind of feel belittled. Discrimination such as being evicted as a result of their abuse or being fired for needing to take time off of work because they have appointments, maybe medical appointments or court appointments. These are all sort of discriminatory against someone because if you look at it, if there's a health issue, you're not going to discriminate against someone who has a health issue, right? You're going to help make those appointments possible for that person who has a medical issue. I don't know if it fits under ADA or if it fits under some kind of health regulation that you can't discriminate because of someone's health conditions. And the same goes true for victims of violent crime. Placing blame on a victim and projecting misguided information about domestic violence and sexual assault to victims. We're all guided by some kind of, misconception about, these crimes, and what we've grown to know or believe is true may not be, right? It's up to us to receive some, education, information about why these crimes happen to begin with. And one of the things that was told to me that really helped me through my advocacy years was, you know, perpetrators, abusers of any kind, any race, any gender, wherever they're from, whoever they are, they're making a choice to be violent. They're making a choice to use violence to, somehow it feeds something within them. They're making a choice to do that, to exert that kind of power and control over someone. They're making the choice, right? So that helped me in my work to take that kind of stigma and blame off the shoulders of victims, that someone made a choice to assault them. Okay, next slide. So a victim's first encounter is so critical, and the type of response a victim receives can make or break a case. That's why I say no matter what doorway a victim enters, in her or his journey, it's so important that they have a good encounter. Uh, they have a good experience at that first encounter. Next slide. So I'm going to take you on this journey just very briefly on each of these slides. It's really meant to show the path that a victim, walks after an assault occurs. And I'm hoping that it'll help illuminate, uh, reasons why often victims may not want to pursue making that 911 call even, right? Um, so in this one, this is a domestic violence incident. And the victim enters the criminal justice system can enter it through different doors. In this one, it's made through 911. The victim calls 911, and from there the response starts. The dispatch receives the call, and I always say that dispatcher has a lot of power to be able to sort of make things a little bit more welcoming to that victim, to be more present, to be more reassuring, to have a calming. And I know a lot of dispatchers now have that kind of training, but I come from a time and place where that didn't always happen. And I still hear stories that sometimes there's things that could have been said a little differently, where the victim may have felt a little more reassurance and that, someone's going to be there, stay on the line with her until, law enforcement arrives or the squad arrives. Um, and oftentimes we have dispatchers there, that'll go above and beyond to say, I know this is a really scary time for you, and I'm sorry this is happening. I'm here, I'll stay on here until help arrives. And to also inquire about, where is this person that harmed you? Are they there? Is there any guns involved? And so those kind of questions while they're waiting um, for the squad to arrive. So once that happens, squads investigate, right? They're going to ask some questions, some key questions about who, when, where, all of that. And that's really just to secure the area, the crime scene, to identify who may have witnessed this, where are they, who all was present when this happened, just a little information about what happened. Um, and then also, asking if there's medical services that might be needed. So calling, the EMS or EMT in might be important to do. We also say this is a good time to also call advocacy. We used to come from a place where we would ask a victim, you want an advocate. And, you know, so this is a difficult time for victims when they're being all asking all these questions, that can be really kind of daunting for a victim. So we say, just call us, we'll come. And if we get there, she don't want us, we can leave, right? So we say the sooner a victim can get an advocate, the better. So in our local jurisdiction, we changed the protocol where law enforcement would call right away, as soon as possible. Um, and if not, we encourage, having our card with law enforcement in their little kits in their squad cars so that they could give a victim a card so that they can call us when they want to do that. And then we make that connection with the victim and develop what kind of needs that victim may have, whether they want to then seek a protection order and so forth. So again, back at the scene, the squad investigates, may make an arrest or may not make an arrest, depending on probable cause. Is there a probable cause to make an arrest? If not, they do a quick report of why they didn't. In most situations, they do make an arrest if the offender is there, and it looks like, yes, an assault has happened here. Yes, we're going to make an arrest, and a report is developed and made available. A case number is given of that case. It is given to the victim, so the victim can do some follow up on what's happening with the case. It's also information that an advocate may also want is that case number. So as the advocate works with the victim, they would have that case number available to them, right? Um, the the perpetrator is taken to jail, and then that process begins with the court process, with being arraigned, having pretrial, having a trial, sentencing, and then monitoring probation, battery, re-education, and so forth. Oftentimes, then a no contact order is made if he bails. They say no contact, and then there's some conditions for the release if he bails. So these are some of the steps. It's frustrating for a lot of the victims that advocates work with, because some of this information sort of gets caught up, somehow slowed down. It's difficult to get information quickly from all of these different steps at these different points. And yet often we tell law enforcement it could be a matter of life and death if this victim, needs to know if he's being arrested, number one. This victim needs to know if he's being arrested, is he out on bail? They need to know that information very quickly, because he could come back to kill her for calling law enforcement to begin with. Okay. Somewhere in this process also, and it's usually the advocates that'll do that, is to inform the victim they have rights. And I suggest to advocates, the sooner the better that happens. We don't want to, you know, just deluge the victim with all sorts of information, but at least if there's a card or something that can be given to the victim in a safe way, that this victim has rights, right? And because there shouldn't be a lot of delays as far as information getting to the victim about the status of the offender, because that's safety information that victim needs for herself and her children. Okay, next slide. So these are the needs for all victims. Safety, and like we mentioned already, you all have mentioned the importance of safety planning. To also, you know, provide the victim with the option of seeking a protection order. And also, if there is court involvement, they can issue no contact orders, right? Um, what's really closely connected to safety is the importance of privacy and confidentiality. You know, that's one of the main reasons why so many victims choose to not utilize systems response to an assault that they've experienced, because they say everyone's going to know my business with social media. Everyone's going to know that cops were called to my house. Everyone's going to know, you know, I have relatives at the police department. You know, that's one of the main reasons why victims don't want to report. And yet there's, you know, that's where victims can be murdered even if they aren't able to access the involvement of law enforcement. So privacy, confidentiality are so closely connected to victim safety that we have to ensure the victim's right to that, to confidentiality. Basic needs for herself and her children. And I'm saying victims, referring to them as her, but absolutely there can be male victims. So I'm not disregarding that or excluding that possibility. You know, we're working with victims where oftentimes we can get really concerned about, you know, their legal rights and so forth. But, you know, deep down, maybe they're worried about, how am I going to feed my children now when I don't have any money? Or I have to leave my home, I have to go to a shelter, or I have to go stay with someone because it's not safe to be in my house or my apartment right now, you know, and yet they may have no money, they may not have any clothes, they left their clothes at their house. These are all basic needs that we need to look at to make sure that victims have access to those basic needs. They may also be concerned about losing custody of their children, because oftentimes batterers will use children to maintain power and control over the victim. So we want to make sure that there's some safeguards in place for that to not happen. And protection orders can provide that temporary custody until other permanent arrangements can be made with, you know, the afterwards with hearings and so forth. Um, Safe housing, permanent, decent, affordable housing, permanent housing, or either staying in her current residence if that's possible. Financial resources, safeguarding her bank account. Does he have access to it? Is he taking out the money? In a lot of cases, that's what's happening. So she needs some protection safeguards to protect her financial interests as well. And sometimes legal services are needed to help her do that, along with her rights to housing, right? You know, she may face possible evictions. I'll talk about that in a minute here with later on in this webinar. Accurate information about options and resources available to facilitate decision making. We want to help this victim make informed decisions. In order to do that, she needs accurate information about her options, where to go to seek different types of services, and what to expect, so she can make those choices herself. Because, you know, if an agency charges a fee for some services, she may not have the financial resources, it may not even feel comfortable asking for financial assistance, right? A lot of our Native people, we're kind of taught to not bother people or not make people go out of their way for us. So she may not even want to ask for financial assistance. So that's also another consideration that we have to make. Um, Looking at accessible resources, services that are victim-centered, trauma-informed, culturally appropriate to promote healing and justice, right? We don't want to refer our, you know, our relatives or our, you know, our victims that we're working with to agencies where there's a history of bad treatment towards Native people or discrimination, right? Excuse me. We also want to make sure her rights are, she's informed of her rights and that they're enforced. We need to keep an eye on that as advocates, in particular, any responders. Each of our agency has a responsibility to be aware of what those victim rights are and make sure that or he's been informed of those rights and that they're also practiced and enforced throughout this whole process as we work with victims and their cases. And just support, you know, throughout this whole process. They need emotional support and oftentimes accompaniment through all of these different agencies that they may utilize. Next slide. So this is the order for protection process. I'm not going to go over it step by step. Um, it's another agency as this victim is on her path, on her journey to safety. This is a resource that a lot of victims choose to utilize is seeking a protection order. And oftentimes the reliefs that are granted at the bottom right corner as they go through all of these different, the benefits of this process, what they entail, having it ex parte, that's a temporary order, right? Without, where the perpetrator isn't served. This is just a temporary order so that she could, feel safe for now until a more permanent hearing can be held. Um, and then once the perpetrator or respondent is served, then a hearing will take place, right? And then there'll be a determination if they're going to grant the OFP or not. Most situations they are granted. And then there's some orders that are handed down where the offender needs to seek help, participate in a men's group, re-education, um, and the protection order is filed. There's some terms, how long it's good for, and so forth. And then also, if there's children involved, how is it that the perpetrator can continue to visit or see his children, and also any matters involving custody and so forth, or child support can also be looked at through this hearing. Um, and the reliefs granted, so yeah, child support, spousal support. Not all jurisdictions have that included in their final reliefs that are granted through protection orders. Most do. Most of them will order child support or spousal support. Um, also determinations about if there's a car involved, who gets that car, and other personal property, such as who's responsible for paying, bills that are like rent and mortgage payments, um, other household kind of expenses like restitution for medical expenses if there were any incurred. And also, childcare and other losses that were incurred as a result of this crime. Enforcement is so critical because it's kind of like, why have a protection order and all of the reliefs granted if there's no enforcement, right? So it's important to, for especially, if a victim can secure a legal representation, if, the protection order is violated, sometimes it's good to have some legal representation to get this heard back in court because there's violations that are happening, and that can become criminal offense on the part of the respondent. And VAWA has made that possible for violations to then become a criminal charge. Okay, next slide. This is the shelter, another resource that victims may want to seek. And again, there's a lot of things that shelters also, they provide safety, they provide a roof over the head of the victim and the children. But they also have a lot of internal kinds of things that the shelter, the battered woman must also participate in or be a part of. They're not mandatory as such, but they're strongly encouraged to take advantage of these. And that could be, participating in some supportive type of listening, counseling, if you will. Maybe they're looking at support groups within the shelter, developing some kind of a plan for what this victim needs while they're at the shelter. Most shelter stays are like 30 days, right? They also may be asked to participate in some household chores just to be able to keep the house moving in an orderly fashion. Residents are often asked to do some of that as well. What's happening with their children? Do they need a child advocate? Do they need to get into school? So all of these things are again a responsibility of this domestic violence victim to look at. and also meet the terms of, the shelter stay. Okay, next slide. There also may be custody issues that a victim is experiencing. This is one of the areas as I worked with battered women and domestic violence victims. If there's children involved, there's a lot of struggle on who gets the children, what's going to happen to the children, how is visitation going to happen. Sometimes the person who's going to, you know, get a visitation plan, they don't show up, or problems that can arise in a whole visitation plan can sometimes happen. So again, victims have to adhere to these plans that are often court ordered, right? She has to be able to take her kids to that location where the batterer is going to visit them. She may not have transportation to get to that place. Is that a violation of the order? Then we have all of those circumstances that happen. Again, this is part of that victim's journey, right? Things that she's compelled to do, in addition to just surviving the trauma of what's happened to her. In order to seek the resources, in order to obtain these resources, she has to adhere to a lot of the things within those services that she's acquiring, these agencies that are helping her. So again, if she's wanting to maintain custody of her children, these are some of the things that she may need to um, experience and go through. So I'm not going to go through them step by step, but this is another map of a journey as part of her journey. Okay, next slide. I've seen in my advocacy work a lot of problems associated with housing, right? Where, victims may experience problems with tribal housing authority, where, the perpetrator controls the financial resources, and they're getting behind on their rent, for example. She doesn't have the money. She's not able to pay it. She doesn't have a job. She's home with the children. He's got the financial resources because he works and also controls that paycheck. So when he leaves, or as a part of the protection order, for example, or because the violence happened and he took off, she's kind of left with the house and or the apartment where she's behind on rent and could face eviction to no fault of her own, right? Or partially, maybe it is part of her responsibility why maybe the rent didn't get paid. But in either case, she's going to need some services to help her get that back rent paid. Um, and if it's something she didn't cause, maybe damages, he put his fist through the wall, or kicked the door open, or broke a window to get in at her. Whatever the case might be, housing may be involved and she could be facing eviction. Again, it could be a discriminatory case because she's being discriminated against because she's a victim. She didn't do anything to cause this. And it's important that her rights are not violated, her right to have housing, and to remain in her house, perhaps even included in the court order. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to quickly review some legal remedies for victims for housing. I believe my colleague Suzanne has posted some additional resources on housing, legal remedies for victims, but I will get to that. It's important to check your local laws, under discriminatory practices related to tribal or state laws or even federal, and how that impacts victims and their right to fair housing, right? Victims should not be evicted for calling law enforcement or for disturbances caused by the abuser. So it's important that advocates really work closely with the victim to document the reasons of what happened, who caused the damages to the shelter, to the house, to the apartment. Landlords, tribal housing authority evicting tenant for abuser causing a lease violation, for example. if she doesn't work, he works, but he controls his paycheck. Uh, and didn't pay the rent, that again is not her fault. If we look at that power and control wheel, oftentimes we'll see, batterers control the finances because if she has any access to any kind of resources that's going to help her get out of that situation or that's going to empower her, he's going to not want that. He's going to not want her having access to that resources that's going to empower her, right? So, and financial resources is one of them, along with children, threatening that he's going to take the children from her. She'll never see them ever again. So it's important to keep that in mind about how power and control is exerted by perpetrators. Referral to emergency assistance for back due rent because abuser controls the family income and it may not have paid rent. So having access to where this victim can secure emergency assistance, and even having access to some of the applications or, where she could find that online, so she could maybe get that form online or have access to it, the information that would be needed in that application. Landlords should provide help by changing locks for the victim and not provide documentation that causes that need. So, it's important to secure the help of landlords that, victims are not to blame for what happens, in this housing situation, and they may need some recourse to maintain possession of the house and the property. There are some provisions that were made under the Fair Housing Act, under, Section 8. So I ask you to take a look at that as well. Landlords cannot refuse to rent, evict, or punish tenants for incidents of abuse or for calling law enforcement. Okay, next slide. Gosh. This is the Fair Housing Act. It just describes classifies sexual harassment and what that entails. Um, I'm not going to read that to you. VAWA provides a right to seek law enforcement or emergency assistance and provides housing providers from taking adverse actions, including eviction. And this is the location for that federal law. It's 34 U.S.C. Section 12495, information on a recent case. Okay, next slide. And I already went through this with you. I just, again, the important role that dispatchers play, and the importance of ensuring a victim rights, getting her the information about her rights early on is really important. Um, and and I put this up here just because as a reminder, this is oftentimes the first entryway into seeking legal assistance, legal intervention for domestic violence. Okay, next slide. So throughout this whole process of victims securing services from any agency, like I said, 911 dispatch is oftentimes the first entry point. From there, it goes to the responding officer, and then also jail can be involved in that. The advocacy program, within the advocacy program, also shelters, child advocacy, medical responders, EMT, ER, hospital clinics, forensic examiners, the courts, clerks, security, judges, criminal, civil courts, jury pools, probation, such as batter intervention, can be involved in probation, and also treatment for the offender. Traditional healers may be involved, community members, and family. These are all individuals that may be involved in situations where there's domestic violence or sexual assault, right? Um, and we add to that legal services for the LAV grantees, LC grantees, because they're also a very vital part of the kind of response that victims are sorely in need of often. And it's difficult to access legal services. So We just really want to be able to strengthen the relationships between advocacy programs, especially those that are tribally based, with these legal services entities that are not often located right in the tribal community itself. A lot of them are, but some aren't. So we really want to be able to strengthen that relationship. But these are all possible services that victims will need, and agencies that victims will contact in her or his journey through this uh, seek to safety. Okay, next slide. So just a quick overview of victim-centered interventions. It must be non-judgmental support, because remember early on I said often victims won't seek intervention, won't seek support because they don't want to be shamed and blamed. They're already feeling some of that already. They don't want to be belittled, to be put down, to be sort of looked at, treated differently, right? They also are concerned about their confidentiality, and it's so closely connected to safety. Um, and they also need some practical assistance. This is where advocates can be really helpful, and anyone in any agency can provide that kind of practical assistance, walking with them kind of on a step by step, because when someone's been traumatized, it affects them physically. It can affect a victim mentally, intellectually, as far as their decision making can be really hampered with assault. Someone saying, "You're no good. You're to blame for this. It's your fault. I'm abusing you, assaulting you because you're bad. You're stupid. You're ignorant." Um, that can be internalized, where the victim starts to believe that, right? Because that victim is believing that, they may not feel adequate to make really important decisions. So this is where practical assistance is so important, to be able to walk with the victim through all of these systems responses is so important. So they know what's coming, what's next in this process, in this journey. Safety planning throughout all of this is important. Again, at every juncture, at every geographic location is also very important to a victim, because it's important to be able to look at possible situations that can come up if the perpetrator shows up somewhere, or even the perpetrator's family, because oftentimes family will become involved to support the perpetrator, saying it was all the victim's fault. He didn't do anything, and he's wrongfully accused, and how dare her put him in jail, right? Like she's the one that has the keys to the jail, or she's the one that's sitting on the bench saying, yes, you're going to jail, or you have your order to pay child support. Those are all done because there's a legal response indicated for the assault that happened. Sheltered related services also have the responsibility to provide victim-centered intervention. To be mindful of victims that are coming into the shelter. They may not be fully equipped to do household chores the first day they're there, right? So it's important, again, to look at what kind of services can be provided to this victim at what point. She may need a day or two to just heal a little bit, right? Um, Protective orders are also interventions that a lot of victims may want to seek out. Okay, so it's important to help give them an understanding of what does that process entail. Walk through them with that map that I just showed you about what to expect. Perpetrator arrest and consequences. Not all are going to be arrested. If they are arrested, where are they going? Whose responsibility is it to inform her that they bailed? When are they going to be informed that that happened, so they can exercise some safety responses for themselves and their children. Some economic assistance. Oftentimes victims are left with no economic resources, so they may also need that as well. So being aware of what are those resources, where can a victim get emergency assistance for, their power is, going to be shut off, or, they're going to be evicted, or other kinds of emergency assistance that they may need, or even services that might be available at local churches, for example. Maybe they have access to food vouchers at local grocery stores or something. These are all types of services that victims may need. Okay, next slide. So I've taken you on this journey that victims often travel, right, to be able to find safety for themselves and their children. What are some of the words that come to mind for you when you look at this? Each one is different, right? That 911 call and the response, shelter, court, protection order, child custody, housing. What words come to mind to describe this journey, this map, where all of that is combined? If a victim were to seek out all of these, what descriptive words come to mind for you? Overwhelming, Kathleen said. Stress, absolutely, stress. And you add the trauma of an assault, fear, scary. Yes, absolutely. Feeling of shame and failure. Absolutely. And these are all things that people who are involved in working with within these agencies need to be aware of, these kind of feelings that a victim may be feeling. If they're apprehensive, it's not because of something that this agency is doing or not doing, right? It's because they've had to travel all of these different the course. They've navigated through this system, this course, sure with the help of advocates, but often they've had to do it themselves, by themselves. Okay, next slide. So legal remedies for victims in situations of employment. And I, as an advocate, have walked with many victims through these different recourse remedies. Check with laws and policies within your tribal, state, and federal laws about employment. Be aware of your employment laws. And that sometimes can feel daunting, but it's, once you have I always say, make a copy, just print it off, put it in a little 3-ring binder for yourself. So the next time you have someone you're working with who has employment issues, that you have access to the laws kind of at your fingertips, right? You don't have to start trying to look at, good old AI or something. Employers must have policies on sexual harassment and maintaining an environment that is not hostile. Caution about employment at will. In a lot of jurisdictions, you have employment at will where employers can just let someone go without cause. Find out if there is any connection to discrimination. Was she being discriminated against because of the domestic violence or because of the sexual assault, because she had to take time off work to go to an appointment, right? That's discrimination for her health. If fired for something related to victimization, have unemployment denied, that she could file an appeal. Some states, employers prohibited from firing victims for sexual assault as it falls under discrimination. Employers must provide confidentiality when they report sexual assault or harassment. Option to file civil lawsuits against employer for losses. So this is where it's important, like way back when we talked about Maya, it's important for her to document as much as possible. How did she suffer? What kind of losses did she suffer because of what Julian was doing to her in the workplace? Maybe she used up all her sick leave because she just felt sick when she thought about going to work, right? Or it did cause her some actual physical illness. To be able to document that and connect it to what was happening in the workplace is really important. Safety at work. Abusers who stalk their victims at places of employment have a copy of the protection order in that place of employment. Description of the abuser and the abuser's car. right? So if we have a domestic violence situation and the abuser keeps showing up at her place of employment, that needs to get documented and he can be charged with stalking, or reports can be made that he's stalking her at her workplace. So safety planning is also really important. What options does this victim have in any situation? You know, whether it's in her workplace or it's at home or wherever it might be, what kind of safety measures can be taken? Next slide. Some of this we're going to get into nitty gritty of legal remedies, and I'm not a lawyer, and I tell advocates, you know, do not give victims any kind of legal advice, right? You could talk to them about their rights, perhaps about where, you know, they could get legal services, where they have someone who can provide them some legal advice. That you're not a lawyer, because we often can get thought of as lawyers. But we also need to make sure that this victim has access to legal resources that are shared between herself and her spouse, for example. You know, she has a right to those financial resources that she helped build. So here's where she might need some legal services to secure her investment in some of these legal resources that are shared. We also have crime victim compensation that she may have access to. Restitution, if it goes through the court process, they can order restitution for her to replace losses, or refund her or reimburse her for her losses. And then again, safety planning. Okay, next slide. Legal remedies and education. Check with laws and policies, again, about educational laws that protect victims in their educational pursuits. Campuses should have a victim rights bill. Requires institutions that receive federal financial aid to afford sexual violence victims certain basic rights. Some colleges may provide additional rights, procedures, and protections, particularly sexual assaults occurring on campus, right? Victims should be accorded the right to education in a non-hostile environment, and also safety planning. I helped a victim once who was raped by a jock. He was a jock in that university. Very prestigious family. They were contributors to the college. And she was raped by him. She was going to graduate, he was going to graduate. They were both seniors. Every time she would show up at their computer clinic or their computer lab, for example, he would show up with his buddies and they would be harassing her, laughing at her, whatnot, trying to intimidate her and get her off from proceeding with her police reported charges. So she came to us as the advocacy program. So we walked with her through the different steps she could take. But ultimately, I ended up saying, let's go to the dean. This is ridiculous. Let's go to the dean and say, this is what's happening. If you don't help her, she has the ability to file a lawsuit. And he made it possible for her to have, you know, be in that computer lab by herself, undisturbed. She had the support of their counseling offices to provide her counseling if she needed it. She basically was able to finish school, get her degree, and get out of there safely. So sometimes it requires that kind of thinking, just to say, forget it. These steps aren't working. Let's go meet with the dean. Next slide. It's a lot of challenges in Indian country, right? A lot of privacy, confidentiality concerns. It's like everyone is related to everyone. Everyone knows everyone is on social media. Some even still have police scanners and kind of know what's going on, where police are going, what they're being called for. When several agencies are involved in a victim situation, such as IHS, law enforcement, courts, advocacy program, social services response teams, you know, that information gets shared within all of those different agencies and entities. That's why it's so critically important to have confidentiality policies everywhere within each of these agencies, privacy policies, privacy protocols. For example, if you're going to a clinic, you sign in on a sheet of paper. You don't want your name on there because the next person signing in is going to see that name right before. So avoid sign-in sheets, right? If you're checking into the ER, you're saying, I'm here because I was sexually assaulted. There's a ton of ears and eyes watching, right? Have a way to do that in private, right? Maybe through a code or something, somehow where a victim can be seen without divulging this in front of all sorts of people. Um, there's a lack of victim-centered trauma-informed services and accessible training and policies. This is why we're doing what we're doing here today, even providing this kind of training, this kind of education, to be able to reduce the stigma, to be able to eliminate barriers, to be able to provide a trauma-informed, victim-centered responses for victims of all of these different types of crimes, no matter who they are, right? And there's a lot more provisions now with VAWA where they could secure those kind of services. There's oftentimes a lack of collaboration and cooperation between agencies. And this is where we talk about where, teams can become really valuable and a good place for this kind of sharing and collaboration to happen. Because like I said, we do better when we work together. And that's how it's been historically, right? We share information, we share resources. That's part of our traditional values is sharing rather than sort of keeping everything to ourselves. We're here to look at the greater good. How is this going to help one another and help our people and help our children especially? Okay, next slide. I have a question. Can healing occur without a sense of justice? Think about that for a minute. And what is justice for victims? In your chat, just provide a couple of comments about that. Can victims heal without feeling a sense of justice? Having a sense of justice? And what is justice? I'll give you a couple minutes. Pretty loaded question, right? Can healing occur without a sense of justice? Someone said moving forward in a positive way. Mm-hmm. It is difficult, but yes, if justice is having the opportunity to tell your story without expectations. Very good. Someone says, no, healing is not possible. I think there has to be some sense of justice, but justice doesn't have to be, it can't always be in the legal system. Absolutely, you're right. Yes and no. It depends on how this person is content with the results of seeking justice. It varies with the victim. It could be the accused being locked up, karma, many different options. Yes. Achieving fairness, keeping dignity, and getting accountability. Thank you. Yes. Fairness, keeping dignity, absolutely. Keeping that stigma away from the victim, whoever that victim is, right? Adult, youth, child, male, female, whatever gender, right? And then having that sense of accountability. And if we're constantly blaming victims, that's not holding offenders accountable, right? So we have to keep that in mind as well. One victim told me that just someone believing me, telling me they believed me, helped me feel like I got justice. So I ask you to keep that in mind, to be able to say, or even a victim hearing, I'm sorry this happened to you, right? That could feel like justice, like they're believed, they're not being blamed. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So I've done a lot of training on going around Indian country, helping tribes develop sexual assault response teams and coordinated community responses, and also even child abuse teams. And lately, more tribes are developing elder abuse, vulnerable adult protection teams. And I just say, they're so important. They're so good to have. So I encourage tribes to look at the development of such teams. And I could do a whole webinar and several webinars on how that looks. What does that look like? Okay, next slide. I've already talked about a lot of this. Challenge in the tribal communities in response to domestic violence, sexual assault. There's still a lot of silence, right? There's still people, we're not talking about sexual assault. The words just are hard to iterate, right? It's like for some reason we don't want to say the word sexual or something. I don't know, but we got to talk about it in order for us to find solutions, especially for our children. If we wrap this kind of shame around it, it's going to be difficult for kids to talk about things that happen to them involving, for example, their private parts. Lack of clear understanding about roles when responding to DV and SA. This is where sometimes teams can help identifying our roles, respecting one another's roles, lack of offender accountability. We still have, assaults that aren't being reported. If they don't get reported, how are we going to seek accountability? Even if they are reported, oftentimes, all sorts of things can happen where that offender just runs free without any kind of consequences. Gaps in the response to DVSA. We still have cases that fall through the cracks. This is where team effort can help some of that. Stronger laws can help some of that. And our agency helps tribes develop stronger laws, and we have resources to help tribes do that. Victims not reporting, still not trusting criminal justice system for a lot of good reason, right? Because bad things have happened to them in the past from those different agencies, especially within non-tribal communities, non-tribal agencies. Victims concerned about confidentiality, privacy, and safety. Culturally inappropriate, insensitive treatment. Hey, so these are some of the barriers that still exist that we can work on, we can remove. Next slide. I've already talked about a lot of this, so I'm not going to reiterate any of this. Just being able to work together, being able to provide opportunities to improve what we do, be able to share those resources, being able to share how we're doing our work with one another to strengthen, to support one another, I think is really important. But understand the dynamics of these different crimes is so critically important. So I invite all of you to look at, sharing your understanding about these crimes and why they occur and how tribes can ameliorate and respond to these crimes and to take the burden off victims for these crimes. Okay, next slide. And I talk a little bit about the role of these different agencies, these different entities, and their involvement. And we'll be talking more about that in future webinars. So I'm not going to go into them in detail. But again, the importance of handling client information and legal documents containing client information in a safe and confidential manner, controlling who has access to this information, participate and collaborate in courtroom safety and court staff safety plans. It's also important to victims to secure their safety, but also it's important to your staff. It's important to your courtroom personnel, your court clerks, and so other individuals working in that court situation to maintain safety concerns. Be responsible for the court personnel segment of the tribal domestic violence court. If needed, provide draft criminal no contact order for tribal court. Prosecute protection order violations. Be responsible for the tribal prosecutor's role in the tribal DV court. And we'll be talking again more about this in future webinars, but I had to just put this in here because it's relative. Okay, next slide. Law enforcement, understand that as a first responder, law enforcement sets the tone. Understand the crucial role of a victim advocate in a domestic violence case, and then calling in that advocate soon. Be responsible for the law enforcement segment of the tribal DV court and their role in that. Understand the importance of regular ongoing training in investigating domestic violence cases. Next slide. And all of you advocates out there know all of these. The power and control dynamics, safety planning, coordinate available resources and services, make referrals, know your information, where you're referring victims to, be a community educator on the dynamics, those causes of why violence happens, work collaboratively with multidisciplinary partners, ongoing and consistent training regarding trauma-informed victim service delivery and safety issues. Next slide. These are the different teams that often exist in tribal communities that tribes are developing in response to these crimes. I'm not going to go over them. I've already mentioned many of them, the MDT, the CCR to address domestic violence, and also the SARTs to address sexual assault. And I could do additional training on these if you need. Okay, next slide. These teams are also about looking at individual protocols within all of their different entities, their different agencies. How are they responding to these different crimes? In sexual assault, for example. So these are steps in the process of protocol development. And this is a model that I've helped tribes utilize in developing protocols in response to sexual assault that occurs within their communities. And these are all people that can come to the table to develop those protocols and train each other on those protocols. Next slide. I've already mentioned a lot of this, but this is the key role of a lot of our multidisciplinary response. These are the things that teams can look at and the work that they can do within their team setting. And it really is about coming together to reduce the silos that still exist within our tribal communities to come work together collaboratively and in a cooperative, respectful way to share information, share resources. Next slide. And again, the benefits of advocacy programs, working with legal services, doing cross referrals, training across each discipline, advocates training legal services training advocacy programs, cross-discipline consultation and communication. And also, advocates can introduce non-tribal legal services to programs within that tribal community to help them, be able to have their resources better utilize the legal services. Legal services having increased understanding of tribal sovereignty and complex tribal jurisdictional issues that compound issues of victim safety and offender accountability. This is so important. I've had a lot of non-tribal legal services that may not be fully aware of the importance of all of these, especially as tribal sovereign nations and what we're able to do. Um, and also better interagency coordination, better use of information to meet survivor needs, and advance culturally appropriate service delivery. So important, so critically important. Okay, next slide. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Marlon and Suzanne, to wrap it up. And again, my last thing I want to say is thank you for joining us. And please, I would love your evaluations. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying. We always have a content rich and really great, wonderful discussions in the chat, and our generous time from our moderator and presenter, Bonnie Claremont. Just as a friendly reminder, this is the third part of a three-part webinar advocacy series, year 2, brought to you by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute as a TTA provider for legal advocacy assistance for victims, expanding legal services initiatives, and grantees and other legal services located on or near tribal communities. We welcome you to visit our website, triballegalassistance.org. As a reminder, our colleague Suzanne Garcia has dropped the evaluation link. We'd be very, very appreciative if you could fill that out. Keep an eye out for upcoming legal advocacy series. There's a slide that delineates when those times are scheduled for June, July, and August. Let's quickly get through. I will leave it here for a little while for the QR code. And also, we have a link for our Tribal Legal Assistance TTA request form. For those who have a little bit more time, we'll quickly go through some of these resources at the end that we really love to circle back on and uplift and share out through our communities. So this slide here has all of our email addresses. Bonnie's email is bonnie@tlpi.org, and Suzanne's is suzanne@tlpi.org. Here is a quick description and titles of our proposed agenda, our proposed webinars for the upcoming legal advocacy series, June 17th, July 15th, and August 19th. Like this webinar, we'll have a single registration link for our Zoom platform, so keep an eye out for that. Here is the URL, triballegalassistance.org, for our main website. And again, Suzanne has dropped the request form, which is our website /request-TTA. There is no way to ask for a TA request. Here we have a sample of some of the publications that the TLPI team has worked on. This is the Victims' Rights Tribal Legal Code Resource for Victims' Rights, a condensed guide. Tribal Victim Advocacy, a pocket guide. And if you visit our main organizational website, home.tlpi.org/publications, you can view our publications by subject and by series. And again, here is that QR code and link for our evaluation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause. As a reminder, we'll be sending out this link to the recording and the PowerPoint deck and the resources that our colleague Suzanne has shared in an email send out after the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. You all have a great day.